In this video, we're going to show you to install the driver's side lower control arm on the front of your Cadillac Escalade. Locate the open notch on the center cap. Use your pry tool. You want to go ahead, get in there, pop that off. Using a 22mm socket, loosen and remove the lug nuts. Remove the wheel and set it aside. Using a 35mm socket, we're going to go ahead and loosen and remove the axle nut. Get to remove the washer. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a brass punch in the center of our axle. I want to make sure that our axle is free, not sticking in our wheel hub. So that is moving. On the top here, to remove this shield, we're going to use our 15mm socket and remove these two large bolts. On the back side, we have two 10mm back here. I'll hold that up with one hand. On the back side, we have two more 10mm. Drop that down and set it aside. On the inboard part of your CV axle, you're going to find a series of 15mm bolts holding the axle to the front diff. I want to go ahead and loosen these bolts. Okay, we have them all free. I'm not going to remove the bolts yet. Just going to spin them out a couple threads. On the bottom side here, you have two 15mm bolts going up to secure the shock to the lower control arm. Let's go ahead and loosen and remove those. We want to disconnect our sway bar end link, securing the sway bar to the lower control arm. We're going to use a 15mm socket on our impact on the bottom and a 15mm box wrench on the top to hold that nut. I'm going to remove the rubber bushing off the top. Using a 15/16 socket, loosen and remove the ball joint nut. On our two lower control arm bolts, the nuts are 15/16. We're going to use our deep socket and our ratchet. And I want to go ahead and loosen these. And we can see here that the bolt head is spinning, so we're going to use an 18mm to secure that. Going to remove the nut and the washer. Going to repeat for that back bolt. And push our bolts out. As we pull our rearward control arm bolt out, it is hitting our sway bar here. So we went ahead and we sprayed down the back side or the top side of the bolts here, securing our sway bar to the frame of the vehicle. They are 10mm. Once you get the bolts out, go ahead and remove the bracket, set that aside. Now what I'm going to do is just move this bushing out of the way. I should be able to go ahead and move this sway bar around a little bit. Move that bushing out. This will push up, allowing us to pull this bolt out of the lower control arm. With the sway bar loose, we can go ahead and manipulate our sway bar end length bolt out. Pull this out, set it aside. Let's go ahead and remove the bolts on the inboard portion of the CV axle. Now rotating this using a small pry tool and going between the other two studs there. And just rotate this around. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and mark the axle with the flange here, because I want to go ahead and reinstall this axle in the same position it came out as. It's not necessary, it's just a habit that I have. Let's go ahead and work that axle off, compressing it out towards the wheel, and then drop this down. So we can't pull our axle out completely yet due to it hitting the base of the shock unit. We're going to use our pry bar and go ahead and drop down the inboard portion of the control arm here. By prying this out, let that hang. That should allow us to go ahead and drop our axle down the rest of the way, like so. Now I'm going to use a deadbolt hammer on the outside of the axle here so I don't damage the threads. I'm going to go ahead and work that axle out. Now at this point here, we can go ahead and pull our lower control arm out of the knuckle. Go ahead and position the control arm ball joint into position. I'm going to go ahead and thread the nut on partially just to hold that in place. Let's feed our CV axle up and into place. Now at this point here, we tried to install our CV axle. What we're having an issue with is that the flange right here is coming in contact with the top of the ball joint on the control arm. What we're going to have to do is tighten the nut on the bottom, sucking the ball joint and the control arm into the knuckle, and then we should have that clearance. Now that we have the clearance, let's go ahead and work this into place. Now that we have the axle on the front, need to push this over a little bit. I'm going to rotate this here. Now that we have that hub flange for the axle lined up, let's install our bolts. Gonna get all these started by hand first, and then we'll come back and tighten them down. Now position our control arm. Bump this up into place. We'll have to push on the knuckle a little bit to get this to line up. We'll do so to get our bolts in. Let's install our back bolt. Now on the front one here, our bushing isn't quite lined up, so we're just gonna use a pry tool, put it inside, and just go ahead and manipulate this here to get that to line up. Install our sway bar end link. Get our bushing installed on the top. And we're going to get that nut with the washer started on there. What I'm going to do is snug our bolt up here, our sway bar end link. I just want to get some threads put through that nut on the top side here. I'm not going to tighten it because I still want to have mobility. All right, we have the bolt coming through on the top. Go ahead and position our rubber bushing back into place. Get our clamp up in. Get the bolt started here. Now with our sway bar installed, let's go ahead and tighten down some of our other bolts. I'm going to use a pry bar and just get on the back side of the shock, and I want to push this over. I'll go ahead and get our bolts started by hand, and then we can come back and snug those down. Now our controlling bolts, we just want to snug these gently till they're just seated. Do the same for the front. Let's torque down our 2 shock bolts to 37 foot-pounds. Let's torque down our sway bar end link bolt to 17 foot-pounds. And we're going to use our pull jack underneath the control arm here. What we're going to do is compress our suspension to a neutral ride height. Basically what that means is we're going to set it to the point where the suspension would be as if it was sitting on the ground with all 4 wheels. So we're going to jack this up. We'll continue to raise this just to the point where it starts to come off of the lift pad or your jack. Go ahead and torque these down to 129 foot-pounds. Do the same for the rear bolt. Our ball joint nut here is going to have an initial torque spec of 37 foot-pounds. Now once you have this locked and you have your 37 foot-pounds, you have to continue and add 125 to 135 degrees. So if we set this right here, actually what we'll do is we'll come right here. We want to do a quarter turn and then a little bit more. So it's not a full half turn. So we're going to go quarter. And a little bit more. Go ahead and remove our jack from the suspension. Now, if you're doing this job at home, you have to replace the axle nut. Do not reuse the axle nut. Go ahead and spin that on. I'm going to tighten that down. I'm going to go ahead and spin our lug nuts on. Just about the middle of the stud. And we're going to use this is a locking tool. So we can go between two studs while we go ahead and torque down our CV axle flange bolts here. I'm going to torque these down to 58 foot-pounds, and you're going to hold that wheel hub, spin this around, put your pry bar back in the wheel studs, and just continue this process. Remove the previously installed lug nuts. These are simply put on to protect the threads from damage when we used our pry bar to keep this from spinning. Install a splash shield. Line that up. I'm going to install the two middle bolts first. This will hold the splash shield in place while I install the other four. With all 6 bolts started, let's go ahead and tighten them down. I'm going to throw on a couple lug nuts here again. What we're going to do is rotate this wheel. I want to use this as a stop. I'm going to go ahead and torque down our axle nut to 188 foot-pounds. Move the pry bar and the lug nuts. Let's go ahead and get all of our lug nuts started. Once these are all on, we'll go ahead and snug them down. Torque down your lug nuts to 140 foot-pounds. Pop on the center cap. Once you've completed this job, you now want to go ahead and bring the vehicle down and get an alignment performed.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.